Because a cat will perch upon your chest and steal your breath. I cannot abide the thought of it. A breath is a powerful thing, the first and last, the most powerful, and yet a filthy cat would claim them? No. I am old now. I will not risk my most powerful breath going to an animal that will not know what to do with it. I nodded, licking my lips and reaching for the figurine. She allowed me to take it, and I held it upright in the palm of my hand. It peered at me with its painted yellow eyes. A baby's scream, a death rattle. One gives you power over life, the other over death. A cat can be sent to collect those things for you, but if you take them yourself, they are much more potent.
Thank you so much for coming. This is Speculative Boston, the reading series, and tonight we have a very spooky lineup, I think. This Speculative Boston is a reading series geared towards science fiction, fantasy, and horror in New England and beyond, but especially for the New England and Boston area because there's such a surplus of genre writers in the area. I'm Andrea Corbin, and I will be your host tonight. I'd like to thank Trident for hosting us, and the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America for supporting the series. We'll start with a reading from Julie.
We're going right in the middle. I'm Julie Day, and I'm going to be reading from one of the stories from the collection called I Want to Be Here. And before I do that, I'm going to take my glasses off because I'm nearsighted, so they're really not going to help me. Among its many peculiarities, the City Hall of Wallington, Massachusetts contains an actual tax office. Even in the summer, faded green and red crepe paper decorations hang down from the ceiling on mismatched lengths of string. Wallington's paper mills and most of its people are long gone. Only the asbestos-riddled infrastructure remains. Forget the internet, web portals, and all the rest. If you want to talk to someone, you'd better show up in person. Francis and I were both in line. I was ahead of him, standing at the counter. He noticed me. Of course he did. In all honesty, I was hard to miss. Curling dark hair and a face termed somewhere between cute and adorable, when not overlaid with cuts and bruises and various degrees of fade. I looked like a rough trade version of the men in Philip DeCoria's Hustlers series. Back in the day, I would have tried and failed to offer someone like me $30 for a chance to take a few quick pictures. Then I would have gone home and created my own staged version with Chester, adding in the extra flourishes, the wounds, and all the rest with my bottle of latex. I don't take those kinds of pictures anymore. While the rest of the tax office line, including Francis, watched, I held out my bill to the woman behind the counter. The third tax abatement in 2 months. They won't stop crashing, I said, trying for a joke. I heard the cell phone of someone behind me ping. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a small patch of fog, or perhaps cigarette smoke, lingering near the glass office door. The familiar headache was pressing in against the base of my skull. Look, I tried again. I just want to clear up this $50 charge. The car is totaled, crumpled, and that Audi, the other car, just disappeared. My voice had lowered. I felt floaty, no longer sure of my facts. The screaming voice was probably just a memory. It's gotta be. The headache made it hard for me to remember, hard to think. The clerk said again. Crimson lipstick bled into the lines that surrounded her mouth. We'll still need a copy of the title indicating the car was classified as salvage. Oh, I said. Papers. Yes. I need to get the papers first. I could feel the muscle under my left eye twitch, another cell phone ping, and a rising scent closer to rubber than tobacco smoke. I turned, ignoring the clerk's confusion, and started back toward the office door. I needed to get out of here. Kodo drummers seemed to have taken up residence inside my skull. Over the drumming, I could hear steps just a few feet behind me. staying close as I moved through the double doors and out onto the sidewalk. I refused to turn around and confirm that no one was there. "Excuse me, sir," a voice called out, not the voice. I turned. It was a man, petite with a sharp jawline and narrow nose. He had, I noted, greased-down blondish hair parted in the middle and sleepy eyes that matched his half-smile. A fox fur stole was tossed across his shoulders. Yes, the Kodo drummers were building to a frenzy. I still think they are. "Hello," the man said. He reached out and grabbed my hand. "How do you do? My name is Francis, Mr. Francis F. Amon." Really? Parents can be so cruel. I pulled my hand away and stepped back. His half-smile didn't even waver. "So, that's a lot of accidents." He tilted his head to one side. "Drugs, perhaps?" "What?" "Well, you don't look crazy. No tinfoil hat anyway. So I was just wondering, those car crashes. Psychically powered or the result of a dissolute lifestyle?" "Drugs, darling." "No drugs," I snapped. "I'm getting a quivery sense here," Francis said. He held up his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "Transformation via vehicular destruction. It fits right in with..." "Look," I interrupted and then paused. Paper again. "Francis," he prompted with that same half-smile. His lashes were a dark fringe that encircled his brown eyes. There seemed to be muscles under that fox fur stole. Shoulders. A man's dick. Perhaps not such a clown after all. "Look, Francis, I've got to go," I said. I scanned the street for the nearest bus stop, slipped my hand into my back pocket and pulled out the contents. $4 bills and some change. Enough to get me home. Francis glanced at the change. "Do you need a ride?" I was no fool. The fox fur could be just a thrift store purchase, but his shoes were made of soft leather. I could see a narrow line of tiny, even stitches holding the pieces together, and he clearly wasn't concerned about the end of winter snow and slush. This man had money. "I'm fine." "Some cash assistance, perhaps," Francis said. "No." I turned and headed toward the end of the block and the bus stop. Francis followed. His cane clicked against the pavement in time with my footsteps. I feel like my articulation is subpar today. I'm not explaining myself very well. I'm looking for a personal assistant, one who can help me with a special type of experiment. "You, dear man," he said, his voice rising with his enthusiasm, "are perfect." "I'm a photographer, not a scientist or anything else." I stopped next to the bus stop's white and blue sign. No other people were waiting, no pedestrians anywhere, just me and Francis. A cab idled by, paralleling the length of the city hall. It stopped at the intersection just beyond the edge of the building. If only I had enough cash to flag it down. A photographer, how fortuitous. I need one of those as well. As well as what? I turned to face the guy. My head buzzsawed with dissonant music. "Science, sir. Real science. A portal to the past. Sled dogs, Shackleton at the ice floe, my own dear grandfather Clemens." Doesn't the past stalk most people's present? Christ, since when did I quote my old therapist to strangers? A car horn honked. Across the street on the far corner was a Chinese restaurant. Thickening tendrils of fog twined above the snow that lined the street curb. I touched my left jeans pocket, feeling for the familiar cylindrical shape of my prescription bottle. Dr. Banks and his trusty red and white pills. I watched the traffic light change to green. The yellow cab was moving through the intersection, the only vehicle. An icy drizzle began to fall. My coat had no hood, of course. Francis's lips were moving, but the koto drummers were drowning him out. And then everything changed. "Please," the voice said, just like it always did. "Please, help me." I caught the sound of squealing brakes. Then a bus came skidding sideways around the corner, past Mr. Wu's Chinese restaurant and the snowbank, continuing in the direction of our bus stop and City Hall. The bus hopped the curb as it slowed down, finally coming to a halt on the sidewalk, not 10 feet away. The number on the display read 314. "Come back," my then boyfriend Chester cried. I couldn't pretend any longer. Koto drummers or not, his voice was clear. "How much did your last photography job pay?" Francis asked. $14 an hour. Through the bus's front window, I could see the driver, a middle-aged guy with graying hair and a comfortable middle. His hand still gripped the wheel. A few more feet and he would have slammed right into the granite building. I watched as he reached over and pulled the handle, released the bus doors, and then stumbled down the steps. A VW Jetta came out of nowhere. I drive around that corner at least 8 times a day. 8 times a day, the guy repeated. I passed by not 1 hour ago. There was no ice then. No parked VW either. "What VW?" Francis asked. "Where's the Jetta?" The driver turned and stared at the empty street. "I'll pay you 20, Francis murmured. "My rent's due on Friday." "Cash, with a week's pay up front." "Deal," I said. Even without Dr. Banks's pills, my headache had disappeared. "Ian, it's basic neurobiology. Memory is nothing but chemicals. We store our past as a series of delicious little micro cocktails. The stronger the memory, the stronger the cocktail." Francis and I were in his car, driving away from City Hall, the bus, and the almost silent street. He glanced at me as though expecting a response, and then sighed when I gave none. The fox head at his neck quivered, almost seeming to sigh as well. "Look, Ian, in some cases it feels like you're actually reliving the past, right?" "I guess. Never gave it much thought." I shifted in the passenger seat of Francis's Audi. If I just out-listened my new employer, maybe he'd finally shut up. Cash or no cash, I was already half regretting taking the job. Francis turned and smiled at me, determined, it seemed, to ignore my mood. "I believe some brains, given the right circumstances, can do more than that. They can actually push through to the past. Ian, think of yourself as a chemical transmitter, a special kind of amplifier. You, my dear, have that delicious combination of trauma and, I'm guessing, a mutation in at least one of your serotonin transporter genes." He paused and glanced at me, considering. "What I don't understand is why you haven't hopped back yourself. You're just so ripe. Cars. It seems to be all about cars with you." I let my left hand slip against his arm and then dropped to his lap. Anything to shut him up. And that's where I'll stop.
Is it my turn? Okay. Hi. I'm from the VH1 Storytellers generation, so I have a little bit of background before I read. 10 years ago, I was sitting in my grandmother's basement. My grandmother was a professional wordsmith. She wrote with Charles Schultz. You might know him. She also was the starter of the Maxine cards for Hallmark, that cranky old lady who's real funny. My grandmother was the original writer of that line. So she always was writing and would threaten to beat me with her typewriter from a very young age. So I learned to respect the words. And 10 years ago, I was sitting in the basement with her in the in-law in my mother's house, and she told me a story about a book she wanted to write. about Welsh Romani. And my grandmother was talking, in some ways, in an autobiographical sense at this point in time, about one sister who stayed with the caravan and one sister who left to go into the big Gaji world of outsiders and, experience what it was like to not be with your people anymore when you come from a very insular people. I was not, when I heard the story and I listened to it, and I was fascinated with it, and unfortunately my grandmother passed away before she could write it. So I hadn't written anything at that point in time, and I went ahead and became an author almost in reaction to her passing. And when it came time for me to sit down to write a novel, I said, well, I don't have the experience of the Welsh Romani, who's experiencing oppression outside in the world, that isn't good to Romani people. And if people don't know who Romani people are, it's what's commonly referred to as gypsies, but that's actually a really, really bad racial slur, so please don't use it. But I use it so that I can at least put it in context. But the other girl that stayed with the caravan, being the granddaughter of the Drabarni, which is the wise woman, that I could write about because I was a horror author and I was creepy. And I was like, I can go places with this. So I settled down and I wrote The Hollow Girl, kind of as an honorific. It's honoring my grandmother and what her vision was, and then kind of making it my vision, and then making it just infinitely more screwed up. So I think she'd approve, though. And what I'm going to read to you right now is basically the main protagonist of this novel, Beth Ann, is being pursued by the clan's chiefs, one of his sons, his youngest son, and it is not a mutual admiration. And this is when the Drabarni realizes that if she doesn't intercede on behalf of her granddaughter, that things are going to go very, very poorly for Beth Ann. Okay, so this is that moment when Gran goes from advising her to keep her head down to, no, now we're going to get proactive. So, tell me about Silas. I reached into my pocket for the coins from market, offering them like they'd buy me an ounce of benevolence, but she waved them away. I shriveled in my seat, the coins squeezed so tightly in my palm they dented the meat. He cornered me this morning, I said. His friends flanked me, so I couldn't escape. I was afraid if I called for help, they'd say I'd invited it, so I mumbled nonsense words and spat to make him believe I'd cursed him. I lowered my gaze to the table and examined the knots and swirls riddling the wood. What had seemed so clever hours ago no longer held its shine. It won't happen again. I'm sorry. Gran said nothing. My face burned with shame, and I wrapped my arms around my stomach. It roiled so much I was afraid it would fall out of my body and plummet to the floor. Still, she didn't speak, not even when she got up to rummage through the cabinet beside her cot. I watched without a word. She pulled out a few jars, a black figurine, and a piece of leather rolled like a scroll and bound with twine. There were feathers and rocks and other things I couldn't identify upon first glance. She collected it all in her apron. Holding her sides together to form a carrying pouch as she returned to the table and arranged the miscellanea in a tidy line. Look, she commanded, and I did, trying to make heads or tails of it. She pushed a wooden fetish carved like a cat my way. It was no bigger than my pointer finger and painted black, some of the paint missing at the tips of the ears and tail, exposing the golden wood beneath. Do you know why I don't allow cats near me? Because they're unclean? Anything from the waist down on people was unclean, and the same applied to the beasts. Creatures that groomed their lower halves with their mouths were particularly vulgar. We never allowed them inside our homes, nor did they make suitable food. If a dog or cat licked a plate or dish, it was contaminated and had to be thrown away. Gran grunted and shook her head. Partially, yes, but also because a cat will perch upon your chest and steal your breath. I cannot abide the thought of it. A breath is a powerful thing, the first and last, the most powerful, and yet a filthy cat would claim them? No. I am old now. I will not risk my most powerful breath going to an animal that will not know what to do with it. I nodded, licking my lips and reaching for the figurine. She allowed me to take it, and I held it upright in the palm of my hand. It peered at me with its painted yellow eyes. A baby's scream, a death rattle. One gives you power over life, the other over death. A cat can be sent to collect those things for you, but if you take them yourself, they are much more potent. Do you understand? Yes. Yes, what? Yes, Gran, I understand. She pushed the second item at me, the leathery scroll tied off at the middle. This one worried me. I didn't read well. I'd attended school at points over the years, but the teachers were impatient with my language gap and believed me to be stupid despite my knowledge of Romani, Welsh, and English. It was the same for most of my people. The prejudice was too much to overcome, so we received a homegrown education of oral histories. The chieftain in particular was a great storyteller, and he'd often say there was no better way to learn than to hear the accounts of our ancestors who had eyes to bear witness to events as they unfolded. Gran agreed to a point, but she said there were gaps in our education too. She'd learned to read and write as a girl, and she tried to teach me the alphabet a few years ago, but I'd grown fidgety and bored, so she said she'd wait until I could better appreciate the gift she was offering. I wondered if the scroll indicated it was that time. "Unroll it," she said. I put the cat figurine aside and reached for the scroll, tugged off the string. When the scroll unfurled, it was not what I expected. The puckered leather was a pair of bat wings sewn together with yellowing twine. There were no letters or symbols. This was another sort of education, one that began with the pale, emaciated remnants of an animal that had died long ago. Horrified by the tacky texture, I almost dropped the wings on the table, but I saw Gran's mouth twitch and thought better of it. She didn't appreciate my disdain for the unsavory part of her craft. But then, as the chieftain once said, a fox didn't smell its own hoe. She wouldn't find the tools of her trade unsavory. A bat that circles a house 3 times invites death. To curse another, you write his or her true name upon a paper and wrap it in the wings. I need not say this is only done to the foulest of people. She pushed a jar toward me and tapped the top. Dead spiders, to plague another with foul luck, you put one beneath their pillow and have them sleep upon it. She thrust another jar across the table. This is snake skin. It's very lucky, as are most snakes. We value them. I re-rolled the wings and nodded as she motioned at other jars, explaining what the contents of each did. To make a man love you, you put a sprig of rowan in his sock. Donkey hairs worn in a satchel around the neck brought good luck. To drown someone, you poured water over their discarded fingernail clippings. To plague someone with hallucinations, you threaded a sprig of dewberry with the victim's hair. To see through another's eyes, you bled upon a hawk's feather and carried it with you. There are other things, blessings as well as curses, Gran said, motioning at the drawer behind her. Dolls you can make to inflict pain, ways to ward against the elements or control them. I hope you are ready to walk this road, Bethan. Once you begin the journey, it is difficult to go back. She collected her totems and tottered back to the table. I was overwhelmed and confused. I'd come home expecting her to censure me for being rash and using my limited knowledge of her practices against Silas, but here she was giving me a lesson in real, actual magic, something I'd yearned for as long as I could remember. "I'm glad for this, Gran, truly, thank you, but why now? 6 hours ago you said I wasn't ready." "Because I have ill-prepared you for some things, and in doing so have done you a disservice. No child of mine will—" She drew a deep breath and stared into the open drawer before her. "I have the tools to help you with people like Silas. He will not shame you if I can help it." She looked at me with her brown eye, but her expression was guarded. In a person less severe than my grandmother, I'd have gone so far as to call it fear.
Excuse me. Cold tea, cold tea. Well, thanks for coming out, everybody. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Trident. Sorry, bookmarks. So my novel, The Cabin at the End of the World, came out. I've had a beer and now 2 teas, and I'm like, ah. Came out late June of this summer, and I'm going to jump in about 3/4 of the way through the opening chapter. So the novel opens up with a little girl named Wen. She's days away from turning 8 years old. She is the adopted daughter of Andrew and Eric, who are around 40 years old and live in Boston. And this family purposefully rented a cabin in a fictional northern New Hampshire. Or purposely rented a cabin, but I meant to say they purposefully rented it so there's no Wi-Fi, no cell phones they wanted to unplug, and I wanted to have a horror story. So the novel opens with Wen out front. It's off a logging road. The next cabin's 2 miles away. They're very much alone. So Wen is out in front playing by herself, catching grasshoppers and putting them into a glass jar. While she's playing, she hears a large person walking down the dirt road, and it turns out to be a stranger named Leonard. Now Leonard is sort of my height, but he's add 60 pounds to him. Dressed kind of weird for someone who's walking like way out deep in the woods. He's got jeans, Doc Marten shoes, and a button-down shirt that's white, like a dress shirt. So despite his size, and despite Wen knowing better, she's had the stranger danger talk with her parents many times, he's very charming and he wins her over, and they play together. He helps her catch some grasshoppers, and then once they're done catching grasshoppers, they're sitting across from each other in the grass, their legs crisscrossed. And the scene picks up when Leonard has a little flower that he's giving to Wen. All right, we'll switch to the scene here. So Leonard hands this flower to Wen. She says, "It already looks kind of dead. Can we pull it apart and make a game of it?" "You can do whatever you want with it. We'll take turns pulling off a petal, and when we do, we ask a question the other person has to answer. I'll go first." Wen plucks a petal. "How old are you?" "I'm 24 and a half years old. The half is still important to me." Wen passes the flower back to Leonard and says, Make sure you only pluck one at a time. I'll do my very best with these big mitts. He follows Wen's instructions and carefully plucks a petal. He pinches his fingertips tightly together to ensure he only pulls out one. There, whew, he hands back the flower. What's my question? Oh, right, sorry, the question should be fast and the answer's fast too. Yeah, sorry, okay, what's your favorite movie? Big Hero 6. I like that one too. He says it matter-of-factly, and for the first time since they've met, she wonders if he is lying to her. Leonard passes the flower back. Wen plucks a petal. Her hand is quick. She says, everyone usually asks, what's your favorite food? I want to know what your least favorite food is. Oh, that's easy, broccoli. I hate it. Leonard takes the flower and pulls a petal. He quickly looks behind him and back down the driveway again and asks, what's your first memory, Wen? Wen isn't expecting that question. She almost says the question isn't fair and is too hard, but she doesn't want to be accused of making up the rules as she goes. My first memory is being in a big room. I was very small, maybe even a baby, and there were doctors and nurses looking at me. She doesn't tell Leonard all of it, that there were other beds and cribs in the room with her, and the walls were green tiled. She remembers that ugly green quite vividly. And there were kids crying in the room, and the doctors and nurses were leaning in close to her and had heads as big as moons, and they were Chinese like her. Wen reaches over the jar, almost knocking it over, in a hurry to get the flower back from Leonard before he breaks the rules and asks a follow-up question. Another petal is plucked away, and she rolls it up into a ball between her fingers. What monster scares you? Oh, the giant ones like Godzilla, or the dinosaurs from the Jurassic Park movies. Those movies scared the heck out of me. I used to have nightmares all the time about being eaten or squashed by T-Rex. Wen has never been afraid of giant monsters, but hearing Leonard talk about it and then looking at the trees stretching beyond where she'll ever reach and how they bend and wave easy in the breeze, she can understand being afraid of big things. Leonard's turn with the flower. He plucks and asks, how did you get that tiny white scar on your lip? You can see it? Barely, only a little, when you turn a certain way. Wen looks down and pushes out her lips in an attempt to see it. Of course it's there. She sees it whenever she looks in the mirror. And sometimes she wants it to go away, to never be seen again. And sometimes she hopes it'll be there forever, and she traces the slash with a finger, like she's darkening a line with a pencil. I'm sorry, I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, Wen. I shouldn't have asked that, I'm sorry. Wen shifts and adjusts her legs and says, I'm okay. The fissure in her cleft lip went all the way up to her right nostril, so the two sets of empty dark spaces overlapped and became one. Last fall, Wen begged her dads to let her see baby photos, the youngest ones of her that they had, the ones from before the surgeries and before they adopted her. It took some convincing, but her dads eventually acquiesced. They had a set of 5 pictures of her lying on her back on a white blanket, awake and her balled up fists hovering next to her unrecognizable face. Wen was unexpectedly shaken by the photos and convinced she was, for the first time, looking at her real self. And this real her was gone, forgotten, banished, or worse. That imperfect, unwanted child was hidden, locked away inside of her somewhere. Wen was so upset her hand shook and the tremors spread throughout her body. After her dads consoled her, she calmed down and gave them an oddly formal thank you for letting her look at the photos. She requested they be put away because she would never look at them again. But she did look at them again, and often. Her dads kept the wooden box of photos under their bed, and Wen would sneak into their room to look at them whenever she could. The scary, the real her was in the baby photos feeling went away the more she looked. Yes, that was her little baby head with a shock of unruly black hair perched above the unmolded clay of her face. Wen traced the boundaries of skin and space of her cleft lip in the photos and then manipulated and moved her own lip around, trying to recapture what it must have felt like having the disconnect, owning all that empty space. Wen says, I had what they called a cleft lip when I was a baby, and they fixed it. It took a lot of doctors a long time to fix it. Well, they did an amazing job, and your face is beautiful. She wishes he wouldn't say that, and so she ignores it. Maybe it's time to get one or both of her dads. She's not afraid or worried about Leonard. Not exactly, but something is starting to feel off. She brings up one of her dads, as though mentioning him is the same as calling him to come out here. Daddy Andrew has a big scar that starts behind his ear and goes down to his neck. He keeps his hair long so you can't see it unless he shows it to you. How did he get it? He got hit in the head by accident when he was a kid. Someone was swinging a baseball bat and didn't see him standing there close by. Leonard says, ouch. Wen says, it's not fair, you know. What isn't fair? You can see my scar and I can't see anything wrong with you. Well, just because you have a scar doesn't mean you have something wrong with you, Wen. That's very important. I know. That's not what I mean. Leonard twists around again and stays twisted around, as though he sees something, but there's nothing behind him other than the SUV, the driveway, and the trees. Then there are faint sounds coming from somewhere in the woods beyond, or coming from the road. They both sit quietly and listen, and the sounds grow louder. Leonard turns back to Wen and says, I don't have any scars like you or your dad, but if you could see my heart, you'd see that it's broken. He doesn't have a smile on his face anymore. His face looks sad, like the real kind of sad, and he might even start crying. Why is it broken? The sounds can now be heard plainly and without them having to be quiet. Familiar sounds, feet tramping and stomping their way down the dirt road, like earlier when Leonard showed up. Where did Leonard come from anyway? She should have asked. She knows she should have. He had to have come from far away. This time it sounds like a whole bunch of Leonards, or bears, maybe this time it's actually bears, are walking down the road. Wen asks, are there more people coming? Are they your friends? Are they nice? Leonard says, yes, there are more people coming. You are my friend now, Wen. I wouldn't lie to you about that. Just like I won't lie to you about them. I don't know if I'd call them my friends exactly. I don't know them very well, but we have an important job to do. The most important job in the history of the world. I hope you can understand that. Wen stands up. I have to go now. The sounds are closer. They are at the end of the driveway, but not quite around the bend in the trees yet. She doesn't want to see these other people. Maybe if she doesn't see them, refuses to see them, they'll go away. They are so loud. Maybe instead of bears, it'll be Leonard's giant monsters and dinosaurs coming to get them both. Leonard says, before you go inside to get your dads, you have to listen to me. This is important. Leonard crawls out of his sitting position and onto one knee. His eyes brim with tears. Are you listening? Wen nods her head and takes a step back. 3 people turn the corner onto the driveway. 2 women and 1 man. They are dressed in blue jeans and button-down shirts of different colors, black, red, and white. The taller of the 2 women has white skin and brown hair, and her white shirt is a different kind of white than Leonard's. His shirt glows like the moon, whereas hers is dull, washed, almost gray. Wen catalogs the apparent coordination in how Leonard and the 3 strangers dress as something important to tell her dads. She will tell them everything. One more turn. And they will know why the 4 of them are all wearing jeans and button-down shirts, and maybe her dads can explain why the 3 new strangers are carrying strange, long-handled tools. Leonard says, you are a beautiful person, inside and out, one of the most beautiful people I've ever met, Wen. Your family is perfect and beautiful too. Please know that. This isn't about you. This is about everyone. None of the tools are scythes, but they look like menacing, nightmarish versions of them, with rough scribbles at the ends of the poles instead of smooth crescent blades. All 3 of the wooden handles are long and thick, perhaps once owning shovel blades or rake heads. The stocky man wearing a red shirt has a flower of rusty hand shovel and or trowel blades nailed and screwed to the end of its handle. On the other end of the handle, pointed down by his feet, is a thick, blunt red block of dented and chipped metal, the head of a well-used sledgehammer. Now that he's closer, his handle looks bigger, thicker, like he's holding a boat's oar with the paddle sawed off. Even as Wen walks backward toward the cabin, she sees the tops of screws and nail heads haphazardly ringing both ends of his wooden handle like fly hairs. The shorter woman wears a black shirt, and at the end of her wooden handle is a pinwheel of raking claws, crooked metal fingers jammed together into a large ragged ball, so her tool looks like the most dangerous lollipop in the world. The other woman wears an off-white shirt, and at the end of her tool is a single blade head bent and curled over itself at one end, like a scroll, and then tapering into a right triangle with a sharp point at the other. Wen's choppy, unsure, backward steps become deep, equally unsure lunges. She says, I'm going inside now. She has to say it to ensure she will enter the cabin and not stand and stare. Leonard is on his knees and his great and terrible arms outstretched. His face is big and sad in the way all honest faces are sad. He says, "None of what's going to happen to you is your fault. You haven't done anything wrong. But the three of you will have to make some tough decisions, terrible decisions, I'm afraid. I wish with all of my broken heart you didn't have to." Wen fumbles up the stairs, still going backward, with eyes only for the confusing amalgams of wood and metal the strangers are carrying. Leonard yells, but he doesn't sound angry or distressed. He's yelling to be heard over the expanding distance between them. "Your dads won't want to let us in, Wen, but they have to. Tell them they have to. We are not here to hurt you. We need your help to save the world. Please." The end.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a question that I wanted to ask since I saw a thread on Twitter from Hillary earlier this week.
Oh dear.
Take the microphone.
Take the microphone.
I want everyone to respond to this, though, because it's an interesting concept. It was a thread about hope in horror fiction. One of the things, if you don't mind me quoting,
No.
was it was kind of the wrap-up that I thought was really, it was so nicely put. Horror is and always will be about a lizard brain need for survival and hoping to overcome odds too big for one person to handle. Which I thought, I had recently read Paul's book, and I thought it was interestingly with that for sure, and with your guys' work too. So could you guys speak about hope as part of your work, how it fits in or how it doesn't fit in with all the stories?
Wow, that sounded really smart. Now I can't think of anything to say. No, in all seriousness, it's funny. I think a lot of people, when they find out that you like horror or that you enjoy horror, believe that it's this voyeuristic torture porn thing, you know, where they're assuming that you're going in because you want to see as many cheerleaders fed to wood chippers as possible in a short amount of time. And, you know, I'm sure there's some people out there that will never come to my house that like that. But for me, it's not about that. It's never been about that. It's about the prevalence of hope even in our darkest hours. You can look at horror going back very, very far, and there are people who are very, very much smarter than I am that could outline this better than I can, and I'm going to do an abbreviated thing here. But horror has always been a thing that reflects the fears of the current time. So, you know, if you look at what is in the horror, you are looking at what the monster of the day is. And the monster is never, I mean, on occasion a zombie is just a zombie, but usually a zombie is not a zombie. A zombie is representative of the things that are hurting us actively in our daily lives. And, you know, I was on a panel yesterday and somebody mentioned that Clive Barker was, you know, making in the 80s horror where the monster was the good guy, because Clive Barker was a gay man. And I mean, this is in the early 90s and stuff, and you're looking right on the heels of the AIDS epidemic. So what he's saying is, well, maybe the thing that you've othered and made into the monster is actually the most sympathetic character in the room. I mean, Mary Shelley told us that 1800 years, you know, in the 1800s, but, you know, she was a woman and nobody listens to women. So, you know, but horror for me fundamentally has to be about overcoming the odds that are at our feet, and whatever those odds may be. And those odds in the books are usually representative of something political, honestly. And, you know, like I said, sometimes a zombie really is just a zombie, but more often than not with horror, I see parallels between current events and, you know, and I feel like the hope that's inherent in the stories of overcoming those odds is hope for ourselves. You know, that we're gonna get through this really dark time. And we're going to be scarred, and it's going to be kind of ugly, and we might smell bad at the end of it, but we're going to get through it. So that was where that thread was born from.
I'm not quite so hopeful.
That's fair.
For me, I don't know, dark, I think is, for me, I kind of have a sense of like this artificial sense of, well, one, agency that's often comes out where you have a desire that people have in a story for control, when yet in people's real lives there is many things they can't control. And so I think often, at least in my own work, I'm looking at what I think of as, it's horrible, sure, but it's also like deeply emotionally realistic, which is that there are no perfect choices. There may not be any good choices, but there may be a moment where you can make a choice that you can find some peace with in all the dark options before you. And so for me, that's one part of it, is to kind of acknowledge how much of, well, I guess I do have a very dark view of the world, how much of the world is chaos, and how very much, how many artificial constructs we place around that. I would also say that horror can be political. It can also just be how we process experiences. So we have a lot of experiences in general. You take a look at, yes, politically things are going on, spikes in depression, spikes in anxiety, but people have trauma. And I think one of the things for me that horror allows people to do, whether there's hope or not, is to go to a really dark place and kind of grapple with their own demons as a part of that, and come out in some sort of transformative way on the other side. And so for me, that's actually quite a powerful thing that horror is able to do that other kinds of fiction may or may not be able to do. So, the horror that I'm typically most interested in, and I guess what I try to do with my own work, is if I can boil down a horror story into there's a reveal of some terrible truth. And this is not original to me. This is sort of riffing on a little bit of what John Clute had to say in his The Darkening Garden, I think it was. There's a reveal of this terrible truth. It could be a universal truth, a societal truth, or a personal truth. And to me, that shouldn't be the end of the book. That should be somewhere in the middle. And then the story becomes, what are the characters? What are they going to do now? What decisions are you going to make? How do you live through this? How does anybody live through this? And to me, those are the most interesting questions, never mind in horror, but just in literature and art in general. So for me, the hope of horror, because I feel like I actually have in a weird way, I've talked about this a few times in some interviews, there is a hope of horror. To me, the hope of horror is in the shared recognition of that terrible truth, that we're screwed. or depending on the story. There's value in that shared recognition that something is terribly wrong. To me, it's sort of that same value or political value I get out of my favorite 80s punk bands, or even like newer punk bands. There's that defiant, whether or not you survive, to me, there's still value in that shared recognition. So I would never argue that a horror story has to end bleakly. It doesn't. If it's going to have sort of an optimistic ending, that optimism needs to be defiant. That optimism needs to bring honor to the experiences of the characters. It can't involve sentimentality. And I'll use a science fiction example, the ending of the Terminator, which could be a horror movie as well, and parts of it. Linda Hamilton's there. I'm going to spoil the movie for you, sorry. Right? She's in the desert. The kid takes the picture of her, and it ends up being the Polaroid that, the father of her child carries around, from time travel. So, it's a sort of a sad moment, and you can see, like, the darkening storm clouds of Skynet in the background. Yeah, the world's going to end, but at the same moment, it's like, F yeah, she's still going to fight. She's still going to, she's still going to go on. And to me, those are the horror stories that are, why are these people going to go on? I'm always interested in trying to explore that.
You looked a little bit like you had something
Well,
to say.
only in that I think that when I say, and I think when any author says hope has to be in the fiction, that don't conflate that with happiness and unicorns
Right.
and sprinkle factories. Like, don't. Because this is a very dark book, but you walk away with a shred of hope. And it's a shred. I'm a jerk. But at the same time, the shred is necessary for me, because otherwise I feel like I raked my readers over the coals until they bleed, sob, and hate themselves a while. Which, maybe that's your thing.
No,
That's cool.
I was about to say, actually, I think you can do that in short fiction. When I write longer things, I think that's not acceptable. You have to give someone some reason for having problems.
I'm just kidding, sorry, I'm joking.
You just literally said a minute ago that's done.
Yeah, you should.
I was just being a jerk.
No, but it's like, a longer piece has to say there can be a change of some kind, even if it's still ugly or not quite, it's a possibility. And usually I'm only as willing to go as far as a possibility. But without that, you're really boxing people in a way that I don't think is fair.
Yeah, it can feel cheap, and that's,
Go ahead and...
Yeah, oh, no. I mean, to me, the cool thing about horror is there's so many different ways to be a successful horror story. Like I've said for years, in interviews about, to me it's always about the characters, and I even try to treat the distasteful characters with empathy, right? That's the way to do horror, but it's not the way to do horror. I mean, clearly Get Out, I mean, the whole town, those aren't characters, that's a social system. You cannot treat those people with empathy. And obviously that movie very much works, brilliantly well. So, I mean, there's so many different ways you can do a horror story. I was just sort of laughing because, it's in the news now, The Haunting of Hill House, the adaptation, but I don't know if there's an ounce of hope in that book. I mean, but again, I think other than the recognition that something's wrong in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, just how it ends with, spoiler, Eleanor walking, having essentially committed suicide, walking alone through the corridors of Hill House. There isn't a whole lot of hope there.
Yep.
But to me, there is in the way of just the recognition and how Shirley, plays the politics, certainly of feminism and presenting Theo.
Yes.
To me, that's where the hope of that story is, and she does that very well. Is the recognition of sort of the reactionary world around them. It's the same with the lottery. The lottery works because we're horrified that this reactionary society is going to continue to be a reactionary society. But there's a little bit of hope because we recognize that.
Yep.
Anyway.
Perfect.
That was great. Feel free to always just talk amongst yourselves and not make me start with another question. The rest of my questions are much shorter answers, I imagine, but we'll see.
Speed round.
Speed round. Here's one I do like to ask because I like to get beyond the newest and latest books, the bestsellers. What's a book, horror book, any book, that you just really wish more people knew about and read?
Oh, why do you have to do this right now?
You can do top 3 if you need to.
Okay. I actually have one right off the top of my head, which is, it was written in the 80s by a British author named Stephen Gregory, and it's called The Cormorant.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Man, it's such a weird book. This London school teacher and his his wife and new child, he wants to leave the rat race of London, and his uncle happens to die and leave him this nice place in Wales. And he gets this free place with the stipulation that he has to take care of his uncle's pet cormorant, Archie. And the cormorant is an asshole. This big black bird, and he just battles with it. But as the book goes along, there's potentially is the spirit of the guy in the cormorant, or is there something even weirder happening? It's such a beautifully written, strange novel. I've never seen the adaptation, but it's one of the first things that Ralph Fiennes was in, late 80s, early 90s, just British television. So anyway, The Cormorant was recently republished by Valancourt Books, who's, I don't know if you know of Valancourt Books, but they're taking all these out of print novels from the 70s and 80s and 90s and republishing them, which I think is a great service.
One book that I really like is Letters from, I think it's pronounced it Tamarin. It's Lena Korn, and it's a translation, but it's letters. It's a city, someone having a very emotional experience where they're writing to an ex-love or something like that. And they're describing their experiences in the city, and the city is various kinds of insects. And they use the natural features of insects to create these really horrific social structures that make complete sense if you were to extrapolate. So that the queen bee is, trapped in this, is a sentient person, but is trapped in this, can't move, can't do anything. And you have termites down in a basement, and it's the visceral experience of it, not a sort of adventure journey, but it's the visceral experience of being immersed in these different kinds of subcultures within the city. And for me, that was just amazing. I'd never seen anything like it.
Sorry, what was the name?
Letters from Tamarin. It's by Lena Korn. Pronunciation's not.
I'm going to go with an author people know, but a work that might not have gotten as widespread reading. So I got 2 in that category, but the first is Shannon Maguire. First of all, she's kind of a friend of mine, and I just worship the quicksand she walks upon. Everybody usually knows her for either her Mira Grant Feed novel or her October Day novels, but she wrote this novella called Every Heart a Doorway.
I just read that yesterday.
Yeah.
It's the only thing I've read by her.
It kind of tore my heart out of my chest and then kind of kicked it a little bit. And what's so beautiful about it is it's exploring, that hero girl in all of YA fiction or young fiction that saves the world. Well, where do you go from there? There's nowhere to go but down. And it makes you kind of crazy. And so there is a home and a place for all of those people that peaked at 11. Because really, what do you do with the rest of your life after you've saved the world at 11? I mean, go to Macy's? It just doesn't. But it's very, very emotionally fulfilling is the best way for me to describe it, because it takes a fundamental despair and turns it into a story of growth and exploration, and it's very diverse and wonderful. And the other one is oddly George R.R. Martin's fever dream. So everybody's all keen on Game of Murder. But he wrote a book that takes place in a riverboat about a vampire riverboat captain going up and down the Mississippi River. It's the best thing he's written. I'll fight people right now. But nobody's ever read it. Like they've read, people either watching the show or they at least know what Game of Thrones is.
I've read it and I agree with you.
Do you agree with me?
Yeah, I'll help you fight.
I love you. We're having a moment. Seriously. Nobody's wolf head gets ripped off and sewn onto anybody else. It's a very different novel. It's quieter, but it's also more elegantly and deftly written in a lot of ways. So those would be my two that I wish everybody had read or would read.
I hope someone was taking notes because I couldn't. I actually want to see if anyone in the audience has questions, because it does look like it's just after 8.
Oh my God.
Yes? You in blue?
Yeah. I have a question that everyone can answer, but it springs off of something that Paul said at the very start of his reading, which is that he set this in a cabin in the remote New Hampshire, which where I live. And so I wanted to. So a lot of horror depends on you putting your characters or your group of characters in isolation, so that whatever the horror is can work on them. So we all know from the detective side of our detective pals that the cell phone has screwed up a lot of plots. And so I wondered if you could talk about how horror deals with the ubiquity of the internet. So if you're having a horror moment, can you call the governor? Can you call the Marines? So that's easy.
Sure,
But
yeah.
can you look it up, Google the horror, and find out maybe how to fix it? Or if you're being defeated by the horror, can you put a post on Facebook so the rest of us know about it? I mean, so how does horror deal with the fact that we're not isolated anymore?
Right.
We're the least isolated people in the history.
I found, so luckily, it was funny, this book to me was a little bit of a break from the internet and social media, because the 2 books prior, A Head Full of Ghosts and Disappearance at Devil's Rock, heavily involves the impact of social media and Facebook and reality television into the lives of my characters. And it was fun for those 2 books to play with the idea that we assume that we're so connected it would be easier to defeat things or easier to at least identify what was happening. And in both of those novels, I made it, social media and reality TV not only made things worse, but made it harder to discern what was really happening. In Disappearance at Devil's Rock in particular, these teenagers, one of them disappears in the woods. It was the same as, this book came out the same time as Stranger Things, but Stranger Things was a lot more fun, and mine was a lot more sad. People like fun horror over sad horror. But anyway, so these kids are communicating through Snapchat. This book was written 4-ish years ago. In Snapchat, like even the police have a difficult time like getting old messages from the server. Like Snapchat, like they'll hold them for a month and then they disappear. So yeah, these kids were communicating, but nobody could find them because they don't have a text record. And some of the messages that they had sent or maybe had some conflicting information. And then people on Twitter are starting all these rumors about a shadowy figure that's running around the town and making people even more panicked. So no, for me, totally, my favorite kind of horror deals with the ambiguity and that our memories and identities and even our existences are a lot more malleable and liminal than we like to believe. And I mean, my God, what's a less liminal time than we're living in, or a more liminal time than we're living in right now in the age of misinformation? There's plenty of opportunities for horror writers to take advantage of it. So with The Cabin at the End of the World, there was actually an intrusion of a television set. It's not it's not the internet, but they do have satellite TV, and even then they'll turn on the TV because the strangers want them to see something, and what they see could just be a news program, or maybe it's proof that the strangers are actually who they say they are. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Good.
I do think R.L. Stine came out like 5 years ago and said horror is dead because of social media and all that stuff, and I said bleep you, R.L. Stine, basically. He hasn't responded. So.
You're trash talking the Goosebumps guy?
I am. I never read Goosebumps. He was.
You need to run more. Yeah, I think what's interesting about that is the idea that the horror genre relied on isolation so much that the polar opposite of it is absolutely the nightmare now, because fake news and Twitter it's like a cesspool with a mouth. It's just, and it's because of that, because of the glut. Like there's just so much, and I love the idea that culturally we have shifted from the isolation being the thing that's terrifying to the drowning in it being the thing that's terrifying. And we have a friend, I know Paul and I share the friend, his name's Douglas Wynn, I don't know if you know him, but Doug was talking about the novel that he's writing right now, is he's raising a teenage boy in a world where radicalization is happening in various guises online, and his entire story is about the horror of seeing what that onslaught is doing to your child and feeling helpless against it. So I feel like, while it can be a challenge for the more traditional isolation narratives, on the other hand, I feel like it also offers a whole ton of opportunities in other ways. So it's just kind of another door that's opened.
And that actually does speak to your point that horror can be very political, because honestly, you take a parent looking at their children, and those are exactly the things, they're looking at.
Yep.
The horror of what they are experiencing. Anyway.
Any other questions in the audience? I think you in the orange had your hand first.
Sure. Okay. So I have a couple of questions. I'm a neuroscientist, and I thought it was very interesting that you chose serotonin transporter gene.
So did I.
I was wondering where you got that from. Was that like a WebMD Google, or is there something more significant to that choice?
The story's old, but I did. Oh, sorry. The story's old, but I do significant research. So I like. At the time, I would have been able to speak intelligently about it, but it's kind of an older story. But yeah, no, I actually spend a lot of time, way too much time, reading like articles around and research papers around things when I play with science, because I want to get it right. So it's not a good answer, but
No. I thought it was very interesting that story centered around sort of migraines and a disconnection from reality, and serotonin transporter is in fact associated with like schizophrenia.
Correct. And I have like if you were to look on my computer, you will see a huge amount of bookmarked and saved information around what's actually a short story.
If I can follow up also, I was wondering, so I liked the ambiguity of that story a lot. Like I had no idea what was going on, but I enjoyed the ride. And I was wondering, in your head when you wrote that, did you have like a clear idea of exactly what's happening, or are you
and it's resolved later, but what I really love to play with is the idea that there's more than one reality, there's more than one way to read a story. So I like to play with the idea that it is virtually true. This is this person's experience, and there are markers that it may not be true, but I don't like the idea of when you're raising a flag and saying this person has a mental issue and this is why they're experiencing this. I prefer the dissonance of both parallel paths following down, and then the ending allowing you to hold on to both of them at the same time. I love that feeling of really discomfort of not knowing what's going on.
So, and if I can just comment on the thing about social media and being able to call the governor, the police, or whatever, I think one of the most potent things in modern horror in that regard is gaslighting. And the idea that like other people may be able to hear what you're saying and just not care or not believe you, right? And I think that's, it speaks to that anxiety about, is what I'm seeing real? Am I just crazy?
And maybe that's why I'm drawn to it. I don't know. That's an interesting point, actually.
It makes me think of, because Paul already brought out Get Out when Rodney's in the police station and they're just looking at him and laughing at him. And like the reality is, I think 50% of the I can't say that word on camera. 50% of the really crazy stuff out there, we'd probably look at it and be like, that's nice, please go take, whatever you need to take to make that stop coming out of your mouth. And that's, we're skeptics as a culture. So, but I'm thinking of poor Rodney trying to tell everybody his friend's been kidnapped by a town of white people. And I'm just like, okay,
Thank you.
I think April, you had a hand up?
Thanks. Yeah, going off of your earlier question, question for the room: is there a historical incident or a piece of recent or earlier or older history that you never see used or turn up in horror or fiction that you wish would get more love, or you'd love to set something there, or you would love to use it, you're just not sure how?
That's a really broad canvas.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sure.
No,
Go
well,
ahead.
mine's
No.
easy.
Okay.
Horror's been very white for a very long time. And just now we're starting to see different people of different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, sexuality, gender ID backgrounds coming to the forefront writing horror. And I can, I'm thinking of Silvia Moreno Garcia's horror in particular right off the top of my head. We're getting actual horror stories from cultures that the standard mainstream media has not fed us. So we're seeing things, not necessarily brand new things. I mean, Sylvia's last novel, I believe, was about a vampire. We've seen a million vampire novels, but we haven't seen hers. And one of the things that you see a lot is people will proclaim a genre dead before the people of color have gotten a chance to go at it. And they have a very, very, they have a completely different worldview that's going to add dimension to it. So when you say that, to me, the first thing that my brain goes to is diversifying the genre gives us more monsters. And is it better for me to write it? Or is it a better, I'm going to write my Romani ones because that's what I know. But I would much rather sit back and let the storyteller from that particular culture or identity tell it to me. And I think that plays well with the question that you asked, which is, what horror do I want to see? I want to see horror done in a way I haven't seen it done before. And who better to do it than the people that were silenced? So. It's not kryptonite.
I can hold it here.
I can break it up for a second and say Silvia Moreno Garcia, I believe the novel is Certain Dark Things.
Yes, it is.
And it's set in Mexico City,
Yep.
which is where she grew up, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah, and
It's wonderful.
it's great.
Aztec vampires is part of it.
Yep.
Woo!
It's great.
I haven't read it, but now I want to.
Oh my god, it's so good.
She's a lyrical writer.
Oh,
It's pretty too.
yeah, I like pretty.
Pretty and gruesome.
I love that.
It's like my brand.
I just add to that, in terms of history, like actual events, even as a writer or as a reader, that's not necessarily what I'm drawn to, but, just to piggyback on what you had said, so Victor Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom, his novella obviously taking on the Red Hook, is that the name of the Lovecraft story? I'm not a big Lovecraft guy, but that's one of his more, in the range of racism and xenophobia. The horror of Red Hook for Lovecraft is, one of the highest ones up there. And, and to see people take, no genre or no trope is dead, to take those tropes and to twist them and, put them into a new understanding or a new viewpoint, a more important viewpoint, obviously.
And it's interesting in that particular example because you have a person of color who the xenophobia was aimed at,
Right.
taking it and going, no, you don't get to do that. And that's what made it so brilliant, was it's almost like a clapback at,
And at the same time, he really loves Lovecraft's fiction.
Yes, he
too.
does.
So it's
Yep.
a really
That's
just sort of
very
it's
interesting
very,
read.
it's layered.
Absolutely, yeah.
Layered.
On a much smaller scale, that's kind of what I'm not less attracted to what's I'll take what's happening in real life, but I like putting a twist on something that hopefully people haven't seen before. Like The Cabin at the End of the World. I don't like home invasion stories. And weirdly, that was why I wanted to write the book. Like I had the idea, I just happened to doodle a cabin in my notebook. I was like, oh, home invasion stories. Like, I really don't like them. There are a few that I do like, but most of them typically are just very thin in character and are about torture and violence. So I was like, oh, okay, Big Mouth, how would you write a home invasion story? To me, that's the exciting stuff, is to try to get new ways into the stories that we've already seen before.
I would just say that one of the things that I think it's sort of easy right now, and I can't do happy very easily, but it's it's easy right now to do anxious and difficult, and it's interesting to see. I want to be to have unexpected. Speaking of hope, unexpected hope. I want to see things that that aren't occurring to people because we are submerged in all this cultural anxiety, and see how someone imagines a place forward. Just personally, I think our imaginations are bigger than that. And I also, as much as clapbacks are great, and they are, I also like the idea of stepping into places that no one has thought to step in before and just do that. I don't want to know. I don't want to be able to imagine what hasn't been done. I want to be surprised.
All right, if anyone has one last quick question, I think we would have time for that. Or I could come up with one.
Did we get through all of yours?
We have one, Andrea.
Oh,
We have
yeah.
one.
Just curious, so besides what you've just read, what are you currently working on?
There you go.
So next summer I have a short story collection coming out called Growing Things and Other Stories. And William Morrow is putting it out, which is very cool because the big publishers usually don't put out short story collections from horror authors. And hopefully for the people that might have read my stuff before, there's 19 stories, but 4 of them have connections to A Head Full of Ghosts and Disappearance at Devil's Rock. So hopefully, that's part of how I was able to sell the collection to the publisher, I think. And then I have a novel due to them next August, so that'll be out in 2020 if we're all still around.
We're all
Come on, I had to say it.
Shush!
By double novel, do you mean a duology?
No, I have a novel due.
Oh, a novel.
Another novel.
Okay, I got it. I thought you said a double novel.
Yeah.
I didn't know what that was.
You read one page and then you read the other.
Well, Theodore Ross did one where you read it one way and then
Right.
read the other
Yeah.
way, so it's possible.
Remember those kids' books where you would
Yeah,
flip
yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Theodore Ross did that with Subprime, I think. Anyway, go on.
No, well, I mostly write short fiction, so right now I'm working on a called Dr. Heller's End of the World Experiment, which is involves female boxers and neurochemical changes and and a solution to emotional issues that perhaps isn't such a great solution. I also have, because I am not long, I'm very impressed with myself for actually having written a standalone novella that's out on submission right now. So for me that was a big leap, because I like pretty a bit too much.
I got 2. First one's The Strange Matter of Miss Havisham. Random House came back and said, you know that idea you had about your follow-up novel for The Hollow Girl? And I said, yeah. And they said, we're not going to publish it. But what we are going to publish is the up-and-coming story of how Miss Havisham got the way she got when she was a teenager. And I said, oh, and you want me to write that? And they said, yes. So I made her really gay. So that's one, and that one's being turned in before I leave for Florida. I say that so that you can all hold me accountable. And the second one is an adult horror novel that I have actually been kind of bludgeoned to write a little bit by Christopher Golden, who's a dear friend. But we'll just leave it at it's about harpies.
That is a great note to end on.
Harpies.
Mysterious and compelling. So before we go, actually, this is kind of my last question. How can people keep up with you after tonight? Twitter, Facebook, etc.
Twitter, Facebook, etc.
How can they find you?
Sorry.
Like, how can they, what are your usernames?
I'm This Julie Day on Twitter. My blog is Still Winging It, which has all my social media links. And if you can, that's pretty much it. And I'm also This Julie Day on Instagram too, now that I think about it.
On Twitter, I'm Paul G. Tremblay. The G is a holdover from childhood because my father's name is Paul N. Tremblay. And I never wanted to be a junior, so when I first started writing, the G was there. And I've never changed it because, anyway, and not that you need to know that story. But I feel like a lot of people have been tweeting at some dude named just Paul Tremblay. and he's just like an egg, there's no thing. And like everyone's on it, it's like, I tweeted at you, like, no, it's Paul G. Tremblay. Anyway, so my Instagram is Paul G. Tremblay as well.
So like my daily schedule is that I write, 400 words and then I get on Twitter. And then I write like 4 more words and then I get on Twitter. And like 12 more words after that I get on Twitter again. So that's where you can find me. I kind of live there. And my handle's Hillary Monahan. So.
No G.
No G. I'm not a tryhard.
Wah, wah, wah.
Okay, so thank you all for reading. Thank you all for being here. I do have last things. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please tell your friends, come again. Our next event will be in January, on January 31st, with the authors N.S. Dolkart and Elaine Isaac right here at Trident. So mark your calendars and please join us. To keep up with any future readings, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, both of which are at Spec Boston. And you can support the series by supporting Trident. The author's books are available up here for purchase, and they will stick around for some signing. You can also, buy food, more drink, etc. They'll be open for a little while longer. So that's all from me. Thank you, Paul, Julie, and Hillary. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you guys.